All right, Chapter 24, Section 4, Bush and Obama Presidencies, the Impact of Terrorist Attack and the 2008 Financial Crisis. So the outcome of the 2000 election, goals and achievements of George W. Bush, impact of the terrorist attack, 9/11, policy goals and actions of the Obama administration. So when we look at the election of 2000, you've got candidate Al Gore, who was Clinton's vice president. He picks Joe Lieberman to be his running mate. And it's kind of interesting because Lieberman was the second choice of John McCain in 2008, who was a Republican. So Lieberman is this moderate. He was at that time a Democrat, but after this he became an independent. And then you've got George W. Bush, who's governor of Texas. When you look at this tight race, the biggest issue was how were they going to spend this huge budget surplus that President Clinton had accumulated. So for Bush, his answer is we're going to give tax cuts. And that way Americans can stop paying such high taxes. It'll put more money in their pockets. It'll grow the economy. Vice President Al Gore wants to shore up Social Security. Let's take that money, let's throw it into Social Security, let's build it up, let's fix it for future generations, and let's pay down debt. It is an extremely close election. And it really comes down to a handful of votes in Florida. So when you look at the outcome, it was within just a few percent. Gore wins the popular vote, but because he loses those handful of votes in Florida, Bush gets Florida and wins the Electoral College. There's a whole process where there's a lawsuit. Democrats want to recount all of the ballots to make sure that the right person becomes president. The Republicans want to stop the recount and leave it as it is with Florida going to Bush. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court rules that the Republicans are right, will stop the recount, and finally on December 12th, 2000, so a whole 4 or 5 weeks after the election is finally decided. So the first thing he's going to push through is his tax cuts. That's what he's going to do with this budget surplus. And so according to this, much like the current Trump tax cuts, the wealthiest are going to receive the most. Now the impact that that's going to have is on the debt and the deficit. It's going to grow fairly dramatically because of this decision to have these tax cuts. And so this budget surplus is quickly going to turn into a budget deficit. The other thing that he's going to push through is No Child Left Behind. How can we hold schools accountable? And what you see is the criticism of this is that this brings in high stakes mandatory testing, that schools have to prove that they're not leaving people behind, and the best way to do that is standardized tests. The other thing that he looks to do is a Medicare prescription expansion. And there's lots of problems in this rollout. And it was also a pretty expensive expansion of Medicare. 9/11, 4 commercial planes are taken over. 2 of them crash into the World Trade Centers. 1 crashes into the Pentagon. 1 was aimed for the Capitol and ended up crashing somewhere in Pennsylvania. So those of you who've been on the Washington, D.C. trip, you know what I'm talking about. In response to this, we invade Afghanistan, which is where Osama bin Laden was hiding. The other thing that we do is we're going to beef up national security. The Patriot Act is going to give the government expansive powers to track and listen in on Americans to try and find potential terrorists or potential terrorist attacks. We also create the Department of Homeland Security, which is going to do essentially the same thing. Later on, we also invade Iraq, thinking that there is terrorist organizations there as well. And also that there's weapons of mass destruction that could be used against the United States. So that's the state of things going into the 2004 election. It's going to be Kerry versus Bush. Because of the war effort, even though Bush's popularity numbers are pretty low, the American people don't like changing presidents in the middle of a war. So because that war continues, that does play a role in his victory. When we look at the situation in Iraq, Saddam is captured, he's tried, he's executed. Now, one of the problems you run into with that is Saddam did a good job of controlling these three different groups within Iraq, the Sunnis, the Shias, the Kurds. Now that he is gone, they have free reign to kind of get after each other. The other thing is we find no weapons of mass destruction or no terrorist ties from Iraq to the attack. And in order to win this Iraq war, President Bush does what was highly controversial at the time, which was a troop surge. He increased the number of troops there. And it ended up, even though it was very controversial, it was very effective and helped kind of stabilize things in Iraq. When we look at his second term, he's also having problems at home. Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, it's handled very poorly. He flies overhead and he makes a few mistakes there, and it gets into the newspapers and the press. When you look at the 26 midterms, he suffers a high price for a lot of these things, and you see his approval ratings falling pretty dramatically. And then what you start to see happening is the 2008 subprime housing crisis. What had happened is, with Republicans being in control, they're taking away some of the regulations and the restrictions on the banking industry. The loan industry started to increase a number of these subprime housing loans. And what it did is it allowed pretty risky homeowners to get loans at a fairly high interest rates. Actually, at first they were pretty low, but as things went up, the interest rates could go up and get jacked up. And sooner or later, what happened is people were no longer able to pay on their loans because the 2000 recession hit and they lost their jobs, they got cuts in pay, and they were no longer able to really be able to afford to pay their loans. Now, the other thing that had happened is Wall Street had taken these subprime loans and had cut them up into little tiny pieces and sold them off to lessen their risk to these risky homeowners. The problem is all the same people bought little slices of all of these risky home loans, and as these foreclosures happened, it looked like Wall Street, the biggest banks in America, were going to go bankrupt because they had gotten involved in these risky loans. So in response, the government passes TARP, a $700 billion bank bailout to help some of the biggest and wealthiest banks in the United States survive this housing crisis. 2008, John McCain is running for president. He picked Sarah Palin as his running mate. One of the big mistakes he made is he said that the fundamentals of the economy were good. And then all of a sudden, boom, 2007, 2008, the financial crisis hit. And that allowed Barack Obama to be able to take advantage of this situation because it made it look like John McCain was out of touch. Extremely large voter turnout. And when you look at what Americans were worried about, 62% said the economy was their biggest concern. So when McCain said the fundamentals were good and they weren't, that kind of gave President Obama the chance to pick up those votes. When he gets into office, he is going to push Congress to have a $787 billion stimulus package, and he talks about it being timely, targeted, and temporary. What can we do to shore up the United States to help grow us out of the recession? The other big thing that he's going to push for is the Affordable Care Act. And one of the big problems that takes place here is that Democrats are in charge of the Senate, and they change the Senate rules so that you don't need a supermajority to be able to pass this. And that's going to come back and bite them later on. Because they use that, Republicans are now able to do that whenever they want, change the Senate rules, change the voting numbers to get things passed through that they want passed through. It's really caused a lot of problems because now Congress and the Senate, they no longer have to compromise with each other to get things passed. It was one of the worst things that the Democrats could have ended up doing. The Affordable Care Act doesn't get off to a very good start right away. The system doesn't work, the computer system doesn't work, and so it's very controversial from the beginning. When we look at Iraq and Afghanistan, President Obama is going to shrink the troop size. That's going to indirectly lead to the growth of ISIS, because what ISIS is going to grow out of is these former military people from Saddam Hussein's years. They resent the fact that the Shias are now in power and they are Sunnis, and that's going to become the heart of ISIS. We're going to increase the number of troops in Afghanistan. And finally, in May 2011, we're going to get Osama bin Laden, and he is killed by American Marines, and that puts an end to the hunt for Osama bin Laden. When we look at economic issues and reform, we are looking at how can we change the financial system that led to the housing crisis. And so they passed a financial reform bill, which gave the federal government more oversight into these risky loans, and it created the Consumer Protection Agency to be able to protect consumers from these loans. What has happened over the course of Trump's presidency is that he has signed executive orders that got rid of a lot of that federal oversight and has really allowed the financial institutions to go back to these risky loans that they gave out prior to President Obama. When we look at the 2010 midterms, again, we can see the signs of things to come. A new group has emerged, the Tea Party movement. What they want is they want to reduce the size and scope of government, which makes them pretty much like Republicans. However, they also see Republicans as big spenders, that they are growing the debt and the deficit, and that they're throwing money after all kinds of problems. And they believe that they're not tough on entitlements. They're not shrinking Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And so that there's this group within the Republican Party that's not going to really work with the Republican Party. It's going to work against the Republican Party. The Republicans win the House of Representatives, and their number one goal is to repeal Obamacare. And so that is going to be their mission. And what we've seen is with the Republicans controlling the presidency and Congress, they still haven't been able to repeal Obamacare. The other thing that they want to do is they want to extend Bush tax cuts. And so that is going to continue to be something that they're going to do. They're going to extend those Bush tax cuts. And then what we've seen with President Trump is he has even increased the tax cuts above and beyond. And what this is a picture of is Senator John McCain putting his thumbs down for the repeal of Obamacare just a few months ago. And that was really the final nail in the coffin of Republicans trying to repeal Obamacare.